to thank all of you for being here this evening. And I want to begin by asking you all a question. I want to ask you, what do you think when you hear the words world peace? What comes to mind when you hear the words world peace? What do you think? Anybody want to share?
The governments don't want it.
Governments don't want it. Good point.
It's possible.
Impossible or possible?
Impossible.
Impossible dream. I think a lot of people feel that way, right? If you ask most Americans what they think when they hear world peace, what do they think? Naive. They think beauty pageants, right? That's what comes to mind with most Americans. Have any of you seen the movie Miss Congeniality? Sandra Bullock. Well, there's a scene in a film where there's a beauty pageant, and an interviewer asks the beauty pageant contestants what they want, and they all say world peace. And it's supposed to be a joke, right? Because world peace is supposed to be a joke. But is it? So you see the problem. If people think that world peace is a joke, how can we ever achieve it? People think it's a joke, and it's naive and it's impossible. How can we ever move toward it? And I can tell you what I thought about world peace when I was growing up, because I didn't grow up in the peace movement. So for a long time, I thought that world peace was a naive dream. My father served in the Army for 30 years, and he fought in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. My mother lived in Japan during World War II, and she lived in Korea during the Korean War. I graduated from West Point. I served in the Army for 7 years. I was deployed to Baghdad, and I left the Army 2 years ago as a captain. But what if I told you that I learned at West Point and in the Army that world peace is possible? Furthermore, a simple question can help us understand whether world peace is possible or whether world peace is a naive dream. And that question is, are human beings naturally violent or naturally peaceful? If human beings are naturally violent and war is something that we're supposed to do, then it would be naive to assume that world peace could ever happen. But if human beings are naturally peaceful and we have to be trained and conditioned to become violent, then world peace just might be possible. World peace just might have a chance. So please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent.
It depends on where you live.
Depends on where you live.
And being raised.
We'll talk about that there. We'll talk about the various cultures. Can all of you hear me better now? Okay. Raise your hand if you can't hear me. Okay, how about now? Okay, that's better? That's better? Okay. Okay, that's better. All right. So raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent. Okay. Raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally peaceful. Okay. Raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent and naturally peaceful. Most hands go up on that one. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the myth that we're not naturally violent. We'll talk about why that's a myth that we're naturally violent and why we are actually not violent. Now, it's actually a counterintuitive idea. It's actually counterintuitive. If you were to go back 2,000 years ago and you were to try to explain to people that the Earth goes around the sun, would that be an easy thing or a hard thing to explain to people 2,000 years ago? Very hard, right? Because if the Earth is moving around the sun, why don't you feel a sense of motion? And you can't tell people back then it's like being on an airplane or a train because there's no airplanes or trains back then. And if the Earth is moving around the sun, why don't you feel motion? And why, when you look up at the sky, why does it look like everything's going around you? So it's a very counterintuitive idea. If you were to go back 2,000 years ago and try to explain to people that the Earth is round, would that be an easy or a hard thing to explain? Very hard, right? Because if the Earth is round, why don't the people on the bottom fall off? Right? Why don't the people on the sides slide off? So people right now are upside down. It's a very counterintuitive idea. And if you tell people we're not naturally violent, it's very counterintuitive because people say, well, if we're naturally peaceful, why is there so much war? Why is there genocide? Why is there murder? So we'll talk about that. And I want to talk about it by asking you all the question. What is the greatest problem of every army in world history? Every army in world history, no matter what time period or culture, has a single greatest problem. Can any of you guess what that problem is? Food. Food? That's a big problem. Keep in mind, armies have lots of problems. Food, supply, logistics. But there's an even bigger problem than that.
Morale.
Morale.
Expansion.
Pardon?
Expansion.
Expansion.
Demonizing the enemy.
Demonizing the enemy.
Leadership.
Leadership. All big problems. And the problem I am talking about is bigger than the opposing army. Because if you don't solve this problem, the battle will never begin. A lot of people say that the greatest problem is training soldiers to kill. Right? That's a big problem. You have to train soldiers actually how to kill. But the greatest problem of every army in world history isn't getting soldiers to kill, it's getting soldiers to die. Right? People don't want to get shot and stabbed. If you look at our fight or flight response in combat, our flight response is far more powerful than our fight response. Most people's natural reaction, when you try to stab them with a sword or shoot them with a rifle, most people's natural reaction is run away as fast as they can, as far as they can. Ask anyone who's been in combat and they will tell you it's terrifying. And General Patton said anyone who says they're not afraid in combat is a liar. So if you walk out into the street and you pull a shotgun on somebody, their instinct is to run, not to fight you. Because our flight response is more powerful than our fight response. So how did armies throughout history learn to make soldiers fight and not retreat? Everything in your body says don't get stabbed, don't get shot. How did armies throughout history learn to make soldiers fight and not retreat? What is that?
Don't desert.
Don't desert? What will happen if they desert? Court-martial, right? They court-martial you. If you retreat, they court-martial you. But always remember this. Immediate fear trumps possible prolonged fear. So if I'm a commanding officer and I tell my soldiers, if you retreat, I'm going to execute you or court-martial you if I catch you. And now there's 10,000 people running at you trying to cut your head off. Which is more terrifying? And if all of you retreat and I stay there, I'll be killed, and now who's going to court-martial you? So when there's 10,000 people running at you trying to cut your head off, that's really terrifying. And that's a much bigger fear to most people than potential court-martial. So how did armies throughout history learn to make soldiers fight and not retreat? There's many techniques, but there's a single most effective technique.
Loyalty to each other.
Fight for each other, exactly. Fight for each other. Here's a question to put that question into perspective. What would all of you die for? Raise your hand if you would risk your life to protect your family. Do you ever wonder why armies have the whole brotherhood and camaraderie and band of brothers? And it's out of military necessity. I think Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher, said it best when he said, by being loving, we are capable of being brave. The Greeks realized that if soldiers believe they are fighting to protect their friends, their family, and their loved ones, they will not only fight, but they will even sacrifice their lives. Because our instinct to protect our loved ones is far more powerful than our instinct for self-preservation. Think about how you would react if you saw your loved ones being attacked. Think about how you would rush to their aid and try to protect them. So I heard a story on the radio a few years ago that kind of helps explain this better. I heard a story on the radio a few years ago about an 80-year-old woman. And the 80-year-old woman was walking down the street and there was a loose pit bull running toward her. So what would you do if you're walking down the street and there was a loose pit bull running towards you? Your instinct is to run, right? Not to fight the pit bull. That's madness. And what if there was a tree right next to you and there's a loose pit bull running toward you? What would you do? Climb a tree, right? What if you're right next to a house? Go in the house, right? But the story was about an 80-year-old woman and she was walking her little poodle. And the pit bull ran up and bit her poodle. And the 80-year-old woman bent down and bit the pit bull on the neck until the pit bull let go. Actually bit the pit bull. But doesn't that make sense? Do you see how the dynamic changes? If it's you and the pit bull, it's madness to fight the pit bull. Absolute madness. You want to run away. But now imagine a pit bull attacking your child, or your grandchild, or your brother, or your sister, or your parent, or your best friend. You would go berserk. You'd grab a stick, grab a rock, try to hit the pit bull over the head. You do something. So do you see when your loved one is in danger, the dynamic completely changes. And you have such concern for your loved one that it trumps even personal safety. So armies require camaraderie and brotherhood in order to function. At West Point, I learned a famous passage from Shakespeare's Henry V, which reads, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." West Point also taught me to treat my military unit like my family. And your military unit becomes your family. You live with these people. And Army training puts you in situations where you have to trust them with your life, where you have to sacrifice for each other, and where you can't get anything done without teamwork and cooperation. And that builds very strong bonds between people. And then in combat, you're put in a situation where if you retreat, the people who have become your family will die, and you have to fight to protect the people you care about. Have any of you seen the movie Forrest Gump? Why did Forrest Gump risk his life to save Bubba in the Vietnam Sea? He loved him, right? They were best friends. So armies make soldiers love each other, and then they will die for each other. So love of comrades is one psychological technique that the Greeks used to make soldiers fight and not retreat. Another psychological technique that the Greeks used was love of country. Love of country. Have any of you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae? Raise your hand if you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae. Okay. Raise your hand if you heard of the movie 300. Okay. When I talk to college students and high school students, everyone's heard of it. It's the same battle. But during the Persian War, the decisive battle was not the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans were defending a pass against the Persians. The decisive battle was the Battle of Salamis, where the Athenian general Themistocles had to defeat a very large Persian navy with a very small Greek navy. So imagine how frightening it is to have one person trying to kill you. Now imagine being outnumbered 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. So the Athenians were greatly outnumbered. And to inspire the courage to make their victory possible, the Athenians shouted the following battle cry. Advance, ye sons of Greece. From oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor. Most people will die to protect their loved ones. I think many of you would die to protect your loved ones. So when the Athenians heard that, advance, ye sons of Greece, from oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor. They were ready to fight to the death. And I think that battle cry has been used by every government since then. Not word for word, but the essence of that battle cry. Because whenever a government was to make a population go to war, they have to say that we're fighting to protect our freedom, or we're fighting to protect our way of life, or we're fighting to protect our friends, our family, and our loved ones. How many wars have there been in human history? Maybe thousands. Too many to count. But you know, in all of military history, all of world history, there has never been a single war where a national leader told his people, we're fighting for money or gold or oil. Every war in human history is about two things, self-defense and liberating people. Even Hitler claimed self-defense. He was defending Germany. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would the greatest problem of every army in world history be, when a battle begins, how do you stop soldiers from running away? And why would governments have to manipulate our love and make us go to war? So think about that. It's another question. What does war do to the human mind? What does prolonged exposure to war do to the human brain? Makes it psychotic. What else does it do? Traumatizes the human brain, right? Think about why there are so many soldier suicides. And you have PTSD. Think about soldiers being addicted to drugs and becoming homeless because of war trauma. Have all of you heard the saying, war is hell? Even the people who support war will say that war is hell. Even the people who advocate war say that war is hell. War is one of the most traumatizing things a human being can go through. War drives people insane. So if human beings are naturally violent, why would war traumatize so many people? If you're naturally violent, why would war drive so many people insane? If you're naturally violent, you go to war and your mental health will just keep improving, right? And you get away from war for too long and you go crazy. But the opposite happens. And there was a study done by Swank and Marchand. They were two medical doctors in the U.S. Army. One was at D-Day. And they did this study after World War II. And they found that after 60 days of sustained day and night combat, 98% of soldiers become psychiatric casualties. After 60 days of sustained day and night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. And keep in mind that 60 days of sustained day and night combat is a 20th century phenomenon. Because prior to World War I, soldiers typically took the nights off. They typically didn't fight at night. And how long was the Battle of Gettysburg?
3 days.
3 days, right? 3-4 days. And if you look at all those ancient battles, the battles typically lasted 2, 3, 4 days, 5 days, sometimes 1 day. If you look at very ancient battles. Marathon, for example. The battle will last a day. The actual combat fighting. And soldiers typically wouldn't fight at night. So think about that. 98% of soldiers, after 60 days of sustained day and night combat, become psychiatric casualties. But 2% of soldiers can be exposed to war for long periods of time and kill and kill and kill and never go insane. So why is that 2% different? Why can 2% of soldiers be exposed to war for long periods of time and never go insane? And why can the other 98% not do that? What's different about that 2%? The reason why 2% of soldiers are never driven insane by war is because they were already insane before they went to war. Swank and Marchand, in their study, found that that 2% is composed primarily of aggressive psychopaths. They're having a good time. But fortunately for us, they're the 2%, not the 98%. And there's a really good book called On Combat. On Combat was written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He trains FBI, Marines, Special Forces, police. And in his book On Combat, he says the first thing you have to know about combat is an environment that is toxic to the human brain. Combat is an environment that is toxic to the human brain. The human brain isn't designed to be in combat, and you have to train people to function in combat. That's what military training and martial arts training is all about. You wouldn't need all this martial arts training and military training if people's brains were preconditioned to survive heavy combat. So another question. During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired the weapons at the enemy? During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired the weapons at the enemy? 10%. Very close, very close. About 15%. About 15%. A lot lower than what most people think. Now, during the Vietnam War, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired the weapons at the enemy? Was it higher, the same, lower? Lower. What do you think? Well, you'd think it'd be lower, right? Because during World War II, we were fighting the Nazis, and Japan attacked us on our own soil. What did the Vietnamese ever do to us? Prior to the Vietnam War, most Americans never heard of Vietnam. And the Vietnamese didn't look like us, but the Japanese didn't either. But it was higher. How much higher do you think it was? 30%? It was about 90%. About 90%. That's a drastic change in a short amount of time, right? During World War II, about 15% of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired at the enemy. During the Korean War, it's about 55%. During the Vietnam War, it's about 90%. Today, it's nearly 100%. So what happened? What happened to cause that drastic change in such a short amount of time? Training, that's it. The training changed. The training changed. What happened was the Army got better at training people how to kill. The key term is training people how to kill. Killing is not nearly as easy as Hollywood makes us think. Most people have a very difficult time killing another human being, and armies must expend enormous effort in order to train people how to kill. And this problem goes back way before World War II. During the Civil War, soldiers spent 95% of their time loading their rifles and 5% of their time aiming and firing their rifle. So you would think that if thousands of rifles had been recovered from soldiers killed in combat during the Civil War, that most of them would not be loaded. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, they recovered about 27,000 rifles. 24,000 of the rifles, 90%, were loaded. 12,000 of the rifles had more than one bullet loaded in the barrel. 6,000 of the rifles had 3 to 10 bullets loaded in the barrel. And one of the rifles had 23 bullets loaded in the barrel. So you see what was happening? Soldiers were loading their rifles over and over again, so it would look like they're doing something, but they weren't firing. So what is it about military training that makes soldiers such effective killers? What technique makes them so effective? Fear? Demonize the enemy. This is one of the misconceptions about military training. Because you don't want soldiers to be too afraid when they're in combat. But they can't think rationally. They're already terrified enough they're going to die. So you want them to be you want to train them to get the fear out of them through repetition. And demonizing the enemy, that's something we'll talk about next, about how the government has to demonize the enemy in order to condone it. But what makes the military training so effective is something called reflex training. Reflex training. Any of you ever heard of reflex training? I can explain it really quickly. Let's say I go out into the street and I try to punch some random person, and the person has no martial arts or boxing training. No martial arts or boxing training. What are 99% of people going to do when I try to punch them in the face? They're going to flinch, right? Cover their face, close their eyes. Flinch. close your eyes, try to protect your face. And that's a very natural reaction. That's a very smart reaction. If you try to punch somebody in the face, the reaction is protect their face. Close your eyes, protect your eyes, flinch. Right? Now, let's say that I punch a boxing bag. Let's say I hit a punching bag every day for 3 hours a day. Every day for 3 hours a day, I hit a punching bag. Okay? I do that for a year. So every day for 3 hours a day, I hit a punching bag. I do that for a year. What will happen now if someone tries to hit me? What am I going to do? I'm going to flinch. Right? Because the punching bag doesn't hit me back. Right? I can hit harder. I can hit a lot harder, but the punching bag doesn't hit me back. So my reflex is still my natural instinct. Flinch, close your eyes. Now, what if I have a martial arts training partner, and every day for 3 hours a day, I have my martial arts training partner simulate punching me. And every time he simulates punching me, I evade and I counterattack. He simulates punching me, I evade, counterattack. And then you do sparring. You do that for 3 hours a day, every day for a year. Now what will happen if someone tries to hit you? You'll hit him back. It's a reflex now. Because when your brain is in that severe, frightening, life and death situation, your brain is unable to think properly. So it goes into these reflex reactions. And I'll tell you a story to show how powerful this reflex training is. I'll tell you a story to show how powerful the reflex training is. In that book on combat I mentioned, and that book also explains where a lot of these figures came from that I just talked about. He tells a story about two police officers. And they were training how to disarm a gunman. So the police officer he'd have his partner pull out a gun, and he would disarm it, give it back to him. His partner would pull out the gun again, disarm it, give it back to him. Partner would pull out the gun again, disarm it, give it back to him. They would do that thousands and thousands of times. So what happened, there was a real-life situation where they went to a convenience store, and there was a robber. And the robber pulled a gun on the police officer, and the police officer took the gun, disarmed it, and gave it right back to him. Without thinking. Right? When you're in that severe life and death situation, you don't think, you just go off your reflex. And there were also situations where when police would be at a firing range, and they shoot their pistols, after they shoot all their rounds, they would pick up the brass from their spent ammunition and put it in their pockets. And they found dead police officers in firefights and gunfights, and their pockets were full of brass. And some officers who were dead who actually had brass in their hands. So in the middle of a gunfight, they shoot all their rounds, they start picking it up off the ground, putting it in their pocket, which makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. But when you're in that situation, you go back to whatever your training conditions you to do. So it's about the reflex. And if you look at World War II training, they would fire at round paper targets, right? But there has never been a war in human history where soldiers were attacked by round paper targets. So in the Vietnam War, you have these targets shaped like human beings. The targets pop up, you shoot it, it goes down. Pops up, you shoot it, goes down. Shaped like a human silhouette. Pops up, you shoot it, goes down. So you get conditioned to shoot without thinking, to shoot off reflex. And if you ever want to know why soldiers kill so many people in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have to look at their training. So if you look at, for example, at police training, look at how police officers train. When they go to a pistol range, they have to distinguish between an armed threat and an unarmed target. So a guy pops up with a machine gun or a pistol or an assault rifle, and the police officer shoots. A woman pops up with a purse, the police officer doesn't shoot. A guy pops up with a shotgun, the police officer shoots. A woman pops up holding a baby, the police officer doesn't shoot. So police training conditions police officers to distinguish. And mistakes still happen, but at least the training tries to make that distinction. If you look at military training, it's still back from the Vietnam era. And soldiers are doing police action. They're doing police action, but they're not given police training, which teaches them to distinguish between armed and unarmed targets. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would every army have to expend so much effort in order to train people how to kill? If we were naturally violent, most people would show up to boot camp, and on day 2 they could kill people. But that's not the case. Another question. Have any of you read a book called On Killing, written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman? Same guy who wrote On Combat. It's called On Killing. It's a book all about killing. It's a book all about killing human beings. And it's one of the most uplifting books you will ever read because it shows that killing is a learned behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman he was a West Point psychology professor and Army Ranger, and he wrote a book called On Killing: The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. On Killing is required reading in classes at West Point. It's required reading at the FBI Academy, and it's on the Marine Corps Commandant's required reading list. On Killing is also required reading in peace studies programs at Berkeley and in Quaker and Mennonite colleges. So people in the military love this book. People in the peace movement love this book. It's a very important book, and I highly recommend that you read it. So the name of the subtitle for the book is, the title is On Killing, and the subtitle is The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. He says that killing is a learned behavior, and we're not natural killers. And that countered everything I'd ever been taught growing up. When I was a kid, I watched Schwarzenegger movies, action movies, right? The hero just kills a whole bunch of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people, and he's fine. No remorse, no trauma, everything's fine. And you read about Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, we're just clubbing each other over the head, we're just natural killers, and society was created to protect people from people. And when you read this book On Killing, you realize it's all nonsense. It's all nonsense. So he says that killing is a learned behavior, and human beings have a natural aversion to killing other human beings. We have a natural aversion to killing other human beings. And other animal species also have a natural aversion to killing their own species. So for example, look at a rattlesnake. A rattlesnake will bite every other animal with its lethal fangs. When rattlesnakes fight each other, what do? They bite every other animal. When rattlesnakes fight each other, what do? They wrestle. They wrestle. They don't bite each other. Look at the king cobra. King cobra will bite every other animal, and they actually eat other snakes. When king cobra fight each other, they wrestle. If you look at buffalo, bull, animals with horns, deer, when they fight other animal species, they try to gut the animal, try to attack from the side, to the belly. But when they fight their own species, they fight head to head. The least lethal form of combat. So when an African buffalo fights a lion, it tries to attack the lion from the flank, from the side, the ribs, right, to rip open the lion's guts. But when African buffalo fight each other, they fight head to head, the least lethal form of combat. If you look at hyena, if you look at wolves, lions, leopards, tigers, when they fight other animal species, they go for strangulation bites and abdominal bites. That's where you want to attack an animal to kill it, the abdomen and the neck. But when they fight their own species, they tend not to go for strangulation and abdominal bites. I mean, think about a dog or a wolf. When a dog or a wolf shows submissiveness, what do? They roll on their back and they show their belly. And the other animal instinctively knows not to attack it. They show their most vulnerable part. If you look at two bears fighting in the wild, how does the fight end? The fight ends when one bear turns its back, exposing its vulnerable part, and the other bear knows the fight's over and it is won. Now, why do animals do that? Why do many animals do that? Why, when an African buffalo fights a lion, does it try to attack the lion from the side? And why, when African buffalo fight each other, why do they fight head to head, which is the least lethal form of combat? Why do they do that?
Preservation of the species.
Preservation of the species, exactly. Preservation of the species. African buffalo spend 99% of their time around what animal? African buffalo. African buffalo. If they fought each other the way they fought lion, the whole species would go extinct. Preservation of the species. And human beings spend most of their time around what animal? Human beings, right? So doesn't it make sense that we might have a natural aversion to killing other human beings? But what evidence do we have? What evidence do we have? The evidence we have is all the military history. All the military history proves this. So in On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says that in order to wage war, a country must portray the enemy as a certain way. The country must portray the opposing side in a certain way. Can any of you guess what that way is? How must a country portray an opposing group of people in order to wage war against them? What must a country do? Less human, right? A country must dehumanize them. A country must take away their humanity. There has never been a single war in human history that has not involved dehumanization. Think of all the wars. Not a single war that hasn't involved dehumanization. And this is done through what Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman calls distance. And he talks about 3 kinds of distance. The first form of distance is psychological distance. Psychological distance means portraying people as subhuman. And this is often done through derogatory name calling. And in On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about how our own country has used derogatory name calling more to portray people as subhuman. So what do we call the Germans when we fought them? Krauts, right? Krauts. What do we call the Vietnamese when we fought them? Goops, right? And keep in mind there's multiple racial slurs for every ethnic group. I'm half Korean, a quarter white, and a quarter black, and I grew up in Alabama, so I've heard most of them. And what do we call the Germans when we fought them? Krauts, Vietnamese, Goops. And what do we call the people that are fighting now in the Middle East? What do you always hear in the media? You hear the word terrorist. The word terrorist. And that word has a racial connotation. When the guy in Norway killed all those people in Norway, the American media called him a gunman. When the guy shot that congressman and all those, when he shot the congresswoman and all those people, he was a gunman. But if a Muslim shoots a bunch of people, he's a terrorist. Right? And this goes way back. This goes way back throughout history. Way back throughout history. Okay? Way back. What did the ancient Greeks call all non-Greeks?
Barbarians.
Barbarians. Any of you know where the word barbarian came from? Pardon?
From the Maghreb.
The language differences, yes. Language differences. If you look at the origin of the term, the word barbarian was a way of making fun of how people talked. The Greeks believed that if you weren't speaking Greek, then when you talked, it sounded like you were saying bar, 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 bar. So they called the people barbarians. So making fun of how people talk and saying that they're making animal noises is a subtle way to dehumanize them. A more overt way can be seen during the Rwanda genocide. Any of you seen the movie Hotel Rwanda? What did they call the people being massacred in Rwanda?
Cockroaches.
Cockroaches. Exactly, they called them cockroaches. So my father's family is from Virginia. That's where my ancestors are from. My father, both his parents are mostly black. His father was a barber. My father was born in 1925. He had me when he was 54 years old. His father was a barber. His mother was a maid, black maid in Virginia. And their ancestors were slaves, right? That's where my ancestors come from. They're slaves. And you see how you have to dehumanize them not only to kill them, but to oppress people. So what's the most infamous dehumanization word in human history? The word for my ancestors. Nigger, right? The word nigger. If you want to hurt people and oppress people and enslave people, you have to dehumanize them. Because if you think they're just like you, it's really hard to do that. So the word nigger is a way to dehumanize people. Right? And so if you look at the abolition movement in Europe, the first movement to abolish state-sanctioned slavery in Europe, they had the very first campaign poster. And it was an African slave with his hands bound, and he was on one knee. And the caption said, "Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a man and a brother?" So they knew back then that the first step to getting equal rights, you have to humanize these people. If you look at the movement in Memphis, where Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, the campaign for equal rights for the sanitation workers, they wore signs that said, "I am a man." Right? Because when you dehumanize people, that's how you not only kill them, but oppress them and exploit them. When they're like you and they're like your family, it's really hard to justify that. So you see how powerful this is throughout human history, and how dangerous these words can be in terms of exploiting people and killing people. And the second form of distance is moral distance. Moral distance means I'm good, you're evil, and God is on my side. And that is why civil wars are so bloody. Keep in mind, the bloodiest wars in human history are typically civil wars. Because during a civil war, you look like the people you're fighting, you have the same language, customs, and traditions as them. So moral distance is used to make people believe that if you kill the enemy, you're expelling evil from the world. So psychological distance convinces people that they're not killing human beings, but subhumans and cockroaches. And moral distance convinces people that they're not killing human beings, but monsters and evil. So do you see how it's easier to kill people if you see them as cockroaches, or monsters, or evil, or terrorists, or gangsters, or evildoers, right? Or barbarians, than if they're people like you and your family. If they remind you of your mother, if they remind you of your daughter, it's a lot harder to hurt people. If they remind you of your mother and your daughter and your sister and your father. This is common sense. when you think about it. The third form of distance is mechanical distance. Mechanical distance means that it's easier to drop a bomb on someone at 10,000 feet than it is to shoot them with a rifle at 300 yards. It's easier to shoot somebody with a rifle at 300 yards than it is to stab them with a knife at close range. So the farther away you are from someone, the easier it is to kill them. Makes sense, right? It's easier to kill people if they look like ants than if they look like your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter. If they remind you of people you know, it's harder to kill them. They look like a bunch of ants squirming around on the ground from 10,000 feet. Much easier to kill them. So here's a question. Why did the Nazis use a gas chamber? Why do you think the Nazis used a gas chamber? Didn't have to look at it. There's a myth out there that the Nazis used a gas chamber because it was efficient. But there's nothing more efficient than a firing squad. What's more efficient than lining people up, making them dig a ditch that will become their grave, making them stand in their grave, shooting them with inexpensive bullets, and throwing dirt on top of them? The Nazis killed nearly 1 million people with firing squads, primarily with firing squads. But they switched to the gas chamber because so many Nazi soldiers were becoming traumatized from killing women and children. Imagine killing women and children every day for 10 hours a day. The Nazi soldiers had mothers. Many of them had sisters. Some of them had daughters. A lot of them couldn't handle it psychologically. And there's all these accounts of Nazi commanders petitioning Heinrich Himmler, telling him, we have to change the method of execution to protect the execution. Keep in mind, 2% can do it, but most people can't handle it. And all these Nazi commanders were saying, we have to change the method of execution to protect the executioner. So it's all about protecting the executioner. It's all about protecting the executioner. When people are being executed, whether it's firing squad, hanging, or electric chair, why are their faces almost always covered? Is it for their benefit? Does the executioner say, I don't want this person to be afraid when he dies? It's for the benefit of the executioner and the people watching the execution. That's what it's for. When gangsters execute people, what do they almost always shoot them? Back of the head. Back of the head. Gangsters, hardened criminals, shoot people in the back of the head because they don't want to see someone's face when they die. Think about that. In addition to the mechanical distance of the gas chamber, the Nazis also used psychological distance by calling people subhuman. And the Nazis used moral distance by calling people evil. If the Nazis would have said all human beings are people like us, do you think the Holocaust would have ever happened? Of course not. A massacre as big as the Holocaust requires all three forms of dehumanization: psychological, moral, mechanical distance. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would every country in history, without a single exception, have to dehumanize the enemy in order to wage war? Why would every country in history, without a single exception, have to create distance in order to wage war? And why would it be so hard to hurt or kill somebody if you see that person as a human being? If you look at somebody and think, that person's like me, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. If you look at somebody and think, that person has hopes and fears and dreams like I do, that person feels joy and pain like I do, that person has a family like I do, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. So I think the idea that we're not naturally violent, which all the military history supports, is very uplifting, because it's also the idea that at our core, we're not so bad after all, and that there is some hope for the human race. Now, I'm not saying people can't become violent. People can certainly become violent through conditioning, through trauma, through abuse. If you look at the violent criminal population, the vast majority of people in the violent criminal population were abused as children. A great documentary, if you want to see how people become violent, is the documentary on Mike Tyson. Any of you seen that? Documentary on Mike Tyson. Really good documentary. Every peace person should watch this documentary. Really phenomenal documentary. And he says that when he was a kid, he was always being bullied. He was always being picked on. He said he was short, he was fat, he wore glasses, and everybody picked on him. And the first time he ever had an altercation with another human being, these bullies took his glasses and put him in a milk cart. He said he just ran. He was so scared he just ran. And he talks about the very first time he got in a fight. The first time he got in a fight, he used to raise pigeons. He would raise these pigeons. And one day, the bullies found his pigeons. And the bullies took his pigeon. One of the pigeons he really liked. And he told the bully, he said, give me my bird back. And the bully ripped the bird's head off and threw it at him. And he said he just went berserk, and he was smaller, and he beat the bigger kid up. Just beat him up. So, I mean, part of the reason I got into the whole peace thing is I was abused a lot growing up. I had a really violent upbringing. I was bullied a lot. And so I developed a very violent temper growing up. And you can train people to be violent. You beat a dog becomes vicious, right? But it's through conditioning, it's through abuse, it's through bad circumstances. We're not born to kill each other. So many people ask me, as a soldier, how did I become interested in peace? As a young child, I had witnessed how war had traumatized my father, and growing up living with him is very frightening due to his violent behavior. So when I was very young, I began thinking about the problem of war and why war has to end. But then many people asked me, if I wanted war to end, why did I join the Army? Well, I think I joined the Army for the same reason many people join the Army. Because in our society, we're taught that we need war to end war, and we need violence to stop violence. Think about Spider-Man, Superman, and Batman. How do they protect the world and save humanity? They beat people up, right? That's what they do. If you look at action movies, the action movies I saw as a child, the hero would kill the bad guy, save the world, kiss the girl, and all would be well. So you're conditioned to think that if you want to make the world more peaceful, you need to use violence as a method. So most soldiers want peace, right? And here are some evidence. During World War II, when we were fighting the Nazis, and Japan attacked us, recruitment into the military is very high. During the Vietnam War, when soldiers weren't sure why they were fighting, it was much more difficult to get people into the military. After September 11th, when we were attacked, an American politician said that we need to use military force to make the world safer and spread freedom and democracy around the globe. Again, recruitment went up. So when people believe they're fighting for a good cause and to make the world safer, it's much easier to get them into the military. I mean, listen to President Obama or President Bush. The soldiers are spreading freedom and democracy and liberating women and fighting terrorism, and protecting America, protecting the world. Do you see how that kind of language gets people to join the military? They think they're doing good. So most soldiers want peace, but peace is the objective, not the means of arriving at that objective. So what happened in my life that caused me to see peace not just as the objective, but as the means of arriving at that objective? What was the transformational process that caused that to happen? Well, during my time at West Point and in the Army, I learned several things that changed my life, and I will share 4 of those things today. The first thing I learned that changed my life was West Point taught me that in the 21st century, the nature of war is drastically changing. And it's changing in a way that many people don't realize. So how is the nature of war drastically changing in the 21st century? West Point taught me that in the 21st century, war is all about winning hearts and minds. It's all about winning hearts and minds. That term became very popular during the Vietnam War, but what does that mean to win hearts and minds? What it means is that you can no longer kill your way to victory. So 1,000 years ago, you kill enough people, you win the war. 500 years ago, you kill enough people, you win the war. But now, you kill too many people, you lose. You kill civilians, more people want to fight you. So technology forces war to evolve. So after the rifle was invented, swords are no longer used. After the tank was invented, the trenches from World War I went away. After the machine gun was invented, people no longer fought lined up in rows. So what new technological innovation has forced war to evolve again? What new technological innovation has forced war to evolve more than the invention of the rifle or the machine gun or the tank?
The camera.
The camera. That's it. Mass media, camera. Who said camera? Great answer. Camera, YouTube, television, computers, internet, right? Facebook. All this mass media, right? Because think about Abu Ghraib. If that would have happened that would have happened a couple hundred years ago, who would have known about it? There's no evidence. And now when civilians are killed in a U.S. drone strike, there's video and there's pictures. It's all over the international news. It's reported now, right? You can't hide things anymore. So West Point taught me that in the 21st century, wars are fought on CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera, and the internet as much as they're fought in the battlefield. And if you're seen as unjust, and images of your injustice are shown to people around the world, you will create new enemies around the world far faster than you can kill them. And if you do not win the hearts and minds of the people, you'll strengthen their determination to fight you tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. So mass media has dramatically changed warfare. Dramatically changed it. And here's a question to kind of bring that point home. What is more dangerous to the American government? What is more dangerous to the American government? 10,000 Taliban soldiers or WikiLeaks? WikiLeaks is a lot more dangerous. Right? Information is now a weapon. And that's what you have to protect. WikiLeaks is very dangerous in this new kind of information war. So I was watching 60 Minutes, and a Marine colonel in Afghanistan said, if you kill 1,000 Taliban and 2 civilians, it's a loss. Why did that Marine colonel in Afghanistan say, if you kill 1,000 Taliban and 2 civilians, it's a loss? Why did he say that?
He's created more enemies.
Created more enemies, exactly. Right? You turn the local population against you. That's common sense, right? What would happen if the Afghan or Chinese or Canadian army came to America and killed 2 American civilians? How would the Americans react? We would go berserk. We would go crazy. How do we react on September 11th? People don't like it when you come to their country and kill their people. It's common sense, right? So that Marine colonel in Afghanistan said, if you kill 1,000 Taliban and 2 civilians, it's a loss. In other words, if less than 1% of the casualties you inflict are civilians, you will lose. But here's the problem. From World War II until today, the majority of people killed in war are civilians. In some conflicts, up to 90% of the people killed are civilians. So do you see why war is obsolete? Do you see why it's so hard to win hearts and minds in war? When the majority of people you're killing are civilians. Just the nature of war. The chaos of war, the confusion of war, the thought of war, you end up killing lots of civilians, even if you don't want to. It just happens. The chaos, the confusion, causes many civilian casualties. So how do you win hearts and minds? How do you win hearts and minds? We weren't able to win hearts and minds in Vietnam. We aren't able to win hearts and minds in the Middle East. How do you win hearts and minds?
Propaganda.
Well, the first thing you have to do, right? The first thing you have to do is you have to admit the fact that people have hearts and minds. You have to admit the fact that people have hearts and minds. You can't dehumanize them. And I think we have to look at the masters of winning hearts and minds. I mean, who won hearts and minds better than Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or Nelson Mandela? I mean, these people were masters of winning hearts and minds. Gandhi was more tactically and strategically brilliant than any general I've ever studied. Gandhi was more tactically and strategically brilliant than Alexander the Great, Hannibal, or Napoleon. And think about it. Gandhi was able to defeat the most powerful empire on earth, the British Empire, without firing a single bullet. Even more impressive, Gandhi was able to transform his enemy into a friend. I think if Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, would have been alive and able to witness Gandhi, he would have been in awe, because Gandhi thought tactically and strategically. Gandhi had been a soldier in the army and had served in the Boer and Zulu wars, and Gandhi used militaristic language. He called his methods the most powerful weapon, and he called his supporters an army of peace. Gandhi even said that if he had to choose between violence and not fighting due to cowardice, that he would rather choose violence than cowardice, but that he had found a better tactical and strategic way to solve a problem than violence, and now is waging peace. Second thing I learned that changed my life, and this might sound, the second thing I learned that changed my life is the idea of waging peace. Waging peace. The idea of waging peace was the second thing that changed my life. What does that term mean, waging peace? Creating connections, right? Creating, it's a verb. Waging peace is an action. It's a verb. It's not being passive. It's not being on a beach. It's not being alone in a quiet room. It's an action. Waging peace is a verb. And the definition, the meaning of it is intuitive. What else does waging peace mean? What are examples of waging peace in history? What are some examples? Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. Great example. What are other examples in history of waging peace? Yeah, Gandhi's salt march to the sea. What are other examples? Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Rosa Parks, Mother Teresa, Albert Schweitzer. Howard Zinn said, between war and passivity, there are 1,000 possibilities. So there's 1,000 things you can do between bombing people and doing nothing. People think, well, if we're not bombing people, then we're isolationists. If we're not bombing people, then we're just minding our own business. There's 1,000 things you can do between bombing people and doing nothing. And those 1,000 different things are waging peace. And our lives have dramatically been impacted by waging peace. Dramatically been impacted. In ways we don't even often know. So think about the Founding Fathers. What did the Founding Fathers talk about? No taxation without representation. What does that mean? Remember from elementary school history class? We want a voice, right? You can't tax me unless you give me a say. You can't tell me what to do unless you give me a vote or participation in the political process. That's a very legitimate complaint, right? No taxation without representation. But up until the 1820s and 1830s, 50 years after the Revolutionary War, less than 10% of the American population could vote. Women couldn't vote. African Americans couldn't vote. Native Americans couldn't vote. White people couldn't vote unless they owned land in most parts of the country. So did the women fight a war? 200 years ago, women couldn't vote their own property. Did the women fight a war to get the right to vote in their own property? Done through peaceful means. Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, many examples. Did the non-landowners fight a war to get the right to vote? Done through peaceful means. What about child labor laws and workers' rights? Done through peaceful means. Now let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about slavery. How many European countries had a war to free the slaves? How many European countries had a war to free the slaves? 0. Not a single European country had a war to free the slaves. And if you look at America, the Civil War held the Union together, but it took a peaceful movement in the 1950s and 1960s before African Americans got their human rights. It took the Civil Rights Movement before hearts and minds were really won toward African Americans. That's what it really took, was the Civil Rights Movement. But think about that part of our history we're never taught, right? And if we want to see how far we can go, we have to realize how far we've come. The third thing I learned to change my life, and this might sound surprising, is that there are far more similarities between waging war and waging peace than differences. And many of the skills you need for waging war, you also need for waging peace. That might sound counterintuitive, but think about all the things you need for waging war that you also need for waging peace. Here are a few examples. Whether you're waging war or waging peace, you need training, organization, planning, recruiting. What else do you need for waging war and waging peace?
Money.
Money. You need funding, right? I work for a nonprofit, we need donations. And there's a really good quote I heard one time. I heard a quote one time that said, "You would not believe how much money it took to keep Gandhi poor." So you need funding for both. What else do they have in common?
Courage.
Courage. You need courage for both. What else? Lots of people have to be involved, right? What else? Anything else come to mind?
Sacrifice and discipline.
Sacrifice and discipline, exactly. Whether you're waging war or waging peace, you need to win hearts and minds. We were trying to win hearts and minds in Vietnam. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to win hearts and minds in America. Who did a better job? I mean, who did a better job in history of winning hearts and minds than Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela or Gandhi? If any of you read about Nelson Mandela, the way he was able to win over some of the prison guards, he was able to get some of the prison guards to sympathize with him. That's really, really powerful. And Martin Luther King Jr. able to get white Americans to sympathize with his cause. That's really winning hearts and minds. You also have to think tactically and strategically. Whether you're waging war or waging peace, you need training, organization, planning, recruiting, leadership, courage, discipline, selflessness, sacrifice, cooperation, teamwork, solidarity. You can see all of these things in the Civil Rights Movement, and you can see all of these things in a military unit. But there are two crucial differences between waging war and waging peace. Two crucial differences. What's different about waging war and waging peace? Killing people, right? Killing people. Using violence is the means. Using violence as the means. If you wage peace, people might use violence against you, but you aren't using it as the means. So when waging war, you're trying to transform a human being into a corpse. When waging peace, you're trying to transform a human being into a friend. It's a big difference, right? But there's another crucial difference between waging war and waging peace. Another crucial difference.
Hate or love.
Pardon?
Hate or love.
Hate or love. That is a big difference, hate or love. And that ties into killing versus transforming into a friend. But there's an even bigger difference. Maybe even a bigger difference in violence. I think Sun Tzu said it best when he said, all war is based on deception. All war is based on deception. When you're near, you want your enemy to think you're far. When you're far, you want your enemy to think you're near. When you're about to attack, you want your enemy to think you're unable to attack. When you're unable to attack, you want your enemy to think you're about to attack. When you're active, you want your enemy to think you're inactive. And when you're inactive, you want your enemy to think you're active. So a long time ago, I used to box, and I learned that boxing is based on deception. You want to hit your opponent with your left hand, but you want your opponent to think you're going to hit him with your right hand. You want to hit your opponent with a left hook, but you want your opponent to think you're going to hit him with a right uppercut. Waging peace, on the other hand, is based on the truth. It involves exposing the truth about women's equality, racial equality, oppression, justice, slavery, war. Gandhi never had any secret war plans. Gandhi never had a top secret file. When he would conduct a demonstration, he would tell everybody what he's going to do, when he's going to do it. Because Gandhi knew that peace requires trust and mutual understanding and improving people's understanding. And Gandhi taught and showed you cannot transform an enemy into a friend by deceiving them, and the truth is much better at winning hearts and minds than deception. So when Gandhi did his salt march to the sea, did he keep it a secret? He told the British, he goes, here's my route, here's my plan, come arrest me if you want to. So you see how it's different. If you look at African Americans, look at Martin Luther King Jr., or look at Frederick Douglass, or look at Rosa Parks, what they're trying to communicate is, look, we're human just like you are. We are human just like you. It's truth-telling. If you look at Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul, all these women in the women's rights movement, they're saying, look, we're human. We're not intellectually inferior to men. We're smart enough to own things. We're smart enough to vote. We're equal to you. And that was true. So it's not built upon deception. It's built on truth-telling. So I consider myself pro-military and anti-war. And people have told me that doesn't make any sense. But it's like being pro-fireman and anti-forest fire. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. is very anti-war. He was anti-all war, he was anti-Vietnam War, and he was anti-all war. And if you heard me say this before, please don't give the answer away. And I think a couple of you know it. Just let people try to figure it out. Because people always get this eventually. So Martin Luther King Jr. was anti-Vietnam War, anti-all war. But did you know that one of the few television shows that Martin Luther King Jr. would let his children watch was a television show that glorified the military? A television show that he himself liked. A television show that portrays people in the military with exceptional level quality. Can any of you guess what a television show was? MASH? A lot of people guess MASH. MASH, by the way, is the Dalai Lama's favorite television show. The Dalai Lama's favorite television show is MASH. But the show I am talking about is the most famous television show ever made. More famous than The Simpsons, more famous than Seinfeld. When the Dalai Lama first came to America, all of his monks wanted to go see the set of this show. So monks in Tibet heard of this show. I'll tell you guys a story. I'm going to tell you a story that you'll get it after I tell you the story. So there was a female actress in the show, and she was at a party, and somebody came up to her and said, there's a fan who wants to talk to you. There's a fan who wants to talk to you. So she turned around, and the fan was Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. came up to her and said, I just got to tell you how much I love your show, how much my kids love it. Just a great show. And she told him, she goes, actually, I'm going to leave the show after this season. And he said, you can't leave that show. He goes, that show is too important. You can't leave it. She was a black female actress.
Star Trek.
Star Trek. Exactly. Star Trek. Great. You ever wonder why it's Captain Kirk, Captain Picard? Why they all have rank? Right? It's a show about the military. Right? Star Trek is a show about the military. They have military rank, military protocol. And Starfleet Academy is based on West Point, even having the same rank insignia and honor code as West Point. But in the future, there's no war, poverty, or hunger on Earth. So the military's mission has changed from war to disaster relief, exploration, peace. And that's already happening to some extent in the world today. For example, the New Zealand Army is no longer focused on waging war. The New Zealand Army performs missions of humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and it protects whales from poachers. And in 2009, the U.S. military performed 154 humanitarian aid missions in 61 countries, focusing on medical, dental, veterinary, and construction. So imagine if around the world, the U.S. military is the only organization in the world that can deploy tens of thousands of physically fit, mentally tough, well-trained people to any spot in the globe. Imagine U.S. soldiers being used for earthquake relief, natural disaster relief, tsunami relief. Wouldn't that be a good way to win hearts and minds around the world? Right? But we are helping people now, so what's the problem? We're helping people. What's the problem? We're also killing people. And we're putting military bases in people's countries. Right? So people are very suspicious. Let's say you go to a restaurant. Let's say you go to a restaurant. And the first 9 times you go to that restaurant, the food is amazing. And the 10th time you go, there's a cockroach in the food. Will you ever go back to that restaurant? So do you see how it doesn't matter how many hospitals or schools you build? When you kill people, it turns people against you. Remember what that Marine colonel said about killing 2 civilians? Right? And America is a very generous country. We are a very generous country. But there's a saying around the world that America gives with one hand and takes with both hands. Now, imagine if around the world the U.S. had this reputation. A natural disaster happens, the Americans come, they help, they leave. Leaving part's important. Wouldn't that be a good way to win hearts and minds around the world? Now, with soldiers like that, if their mission changed from war to disaster relief, I think 98% of them would. 2% might not. And here's a quote from General MacArthur. General MacArthur had a really good quote. If you ever wonder whether soldiers would like that kind of mission, remember this quote from General MacArthur. General MacArthur said, "The soldier above all other people prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war." The soldier above all other people prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. Now, keep this in mind. Anybody know the new Navy motto? The new Navy recruiting motto? A global force for good. So the military is already, it shows a change in consciousness where if you want to recruit people into the military, you have this very idealistic approach. So a global force for good. They have Navy commercials now where it's all about disaster relief, showing that you have to recruit people differently now. Have you ever seen a military recruiting commercial that says anything about killing people? Ever? Right. And I met this guy from Pakistan. I met a guy from Pakistan about a year ago in Washington. And he came up to me after my talk and he said, "There's something I never understood until I heard your talk." He said, "Something I never understood was I always saw Americans as being the friendliest people in the world. Americans are so kind and so generous and so hospitable and so optimistic." He goes, "But their government is so terrible. Their government does so many terrible things around the world, supporting dictatorships, waging war." And he goes, "I never understood this contradiction." He said, "I never understood this contradiction. I never understood how the American people could be so wonderful and so generous and so kind, and their government could be so violent and so terrible." And he goes, "I finally figured out the contradiction." He said, "I finally figured out why the American people are so wonderful and the government is so terrible." He said, "The American people don't know what their government is doing." Most Americans have no clue that we're supporting dictatorships, and we're overthrowing democratic governments, and we're waging war, right? In ways that they aren't being taught the real justification for. The last thing I learned that I'll talk about this evening that changed my life is that war is not inevitable and that world peace is possible. General Omar Bradley, one of the last 5-star generals, said, "It is easy for us who are living to honor the sacrifices of those who are dead, because it helps us to relieve the guilt we should feel in their presence. Wars can be prevented just as surely as they are provoked, and therefore we who fail to prevent wars share in guilt for the dead." So General Omar Bradley said, wars can be prevented just as surely as they are provoked, and therefore we who fail to prevent wars share in guilt for the dead. There's so much we can do to prevent wars and make a difference. And look at what has happened because people did something and made a difference. 200 years ago in America, anyone who was not a white male landowner was oppressed. If you were African American, Asian, Hispanic, female, even if you were white, but you did not own land, you were oppressed. But look at how far we've come because of the women's rights, civil rights, and workers' rights movements. I'm half Korean, a quarter white, and a quarter black, and I grew up in Alabama, and the fact that I'm here shows you how far our country has come. And if you look globally, 500 years ago, things such as democracy, the right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, women's and civil rights, virtually did not exist anywhere on the planet. How many countries were democracies 500 years ago? 0. How many countries were democracies 200 years ago? Keep in mind, Napoleon overthrew the democratic government in France. Napoleon became a military dictator, so France wasn't a democracy 200 years ago. So the only country back then that was a democracy was America. Right? We were the democratic experiment. But America wasn't a democracy if you were African American. America wasn't a democracy if you were female. America wasn't a democracy if you were Hispanic or Native American. America wasn't a democracy if you were white, unless you own land. And now, in less than 200 years, democracies all over the world, North America, South America, Europe, parts of Asia, parts of the Middle East, Australia, New Zealand, less than 200 years. And we have to distinguish between a couple of terms, right? We live in a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. But we have to distinguish between democracy as a form of government and democratic ideals. The democratic ideals being the right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right? Human rights, freedom of the press. Those ideals are very popular around the world. That's what's really popular about that democracy is the idealism. That all men are created equal. Right? We all have a right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And I gave this talk one time, and somebody said, "You're wasting your time, because no matter how hard you try, you'll never convince everyone." I responded by saying, "But I don't have to convince everyone. What % of the American population actively participated in the women's rights movement? Less than 1% actively participated. Susan B. Anthony would give a talk about women's rights, and people would be screaming at her so loud she couldn't hear herself speak. And the people screaming at her were women. Very controversial issue. What % of the American population actively participated in the civil rights movement? Less than 1%. Less than 1% actively participated. And that's why Henry David Thoreau said, "There are 999 patrons of virtue for every virtuous person." So in other words, for every 999 people who think something's a good idea, one person does something about it. So that's why opinion polls, 70% of people think this or that. Opinion without action has no impact. And dramatic things have changed. Does every single man in America right now think that women should have the right to vote? No. Of course not, right? But if a man tries to prevent a woman from voting, he's going to get arrested. Does every white man in America think that African Americans should have equal rights? Certainly not. But if a white person tries to bring back segregation, they go to prison. So you'll never convince everybody. Never convince everybody, but you convince enough people where it becomes a law. And then those few people who you can't ever convince, they have to obey the law. They go to jail. Right? And today it's even more important that we become highly trained in the art of waging peace. Keep in mind, it's not just about 1% being active. That 1% has to be very effective. They have to have a very effective strategy, very effective approach. They have to be well-trained, disciplined, creative. They have to have a very effective technique to get the masses to understand an issue. And today it's even more important that we become part of that 1%. Today it's even more important that we become highly trained in the art of waging peace. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. waged peace in order to create a brighter future. But today, due to the dangers posed by nuclear weapons, war, and our destruction of the environment, if we don't wage peace, we won't have a future. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. waged peace in order to create a better world. But today, we have to wage peace in order to ensure the survival of our world. So it's up to us to solve these problems. Now more than ever, the world needs you to wage peace. And I hope that you will all become part of the 1%, not the 2%. Thank you.